Today let's take some Barnwood lumber, build some breadboard and tabletops, and figure out how to attach them to the table base. Hey everyone, how's it going? So, a couple of years ago my in-laws renovated their kitchen and they asked me to build them a table using reclaimed barnwood. In the previous videos that you can check out up here, I went over harvesting the barnwood out of the wall of the barn and turned it into usable lumber, and built the table base that I'm going to be using for this project. Just like last time, at this point the materials are already stabilized, planed, squared, and cut to final length. So the first step for this portion is to figure out the layout of the panels. Since I already have my breadboard ends cut to length, I'm using these as my guides to figure out how many boards I need per top, since none of them are the same width, and lay out all of the boards across the breadboards. Once I have the number of boards figured out, I start flipping through and figuring out the best compromise between grain pattern, epoxy quantity, bug tracks, and general aesthetic. As much as I want the most interesting looking boards on the show side of the tabletops, that isn't necessarily the best for the stability of the tabletop in the long term. When building a panel like this, you want to make sure that you are alternating grain directions between boards. For the ease of explanation, we'll call it smiley and sad face alternating. Since all of this material, albeit being over a century old, was only milled recently, in theory there is still some board tension that will be released over time. If your panel is straight smiley faces, the board can relax downward, causing a big hump in the middle of your panel, and the opposite can happen if it is straight sad face, where it'll just curve up. Either way, you'll be getting a Pringle out of it. Ideally, the end grain of your panel should look more like a bunch of mood swings. Happy, sad, happy, sad, happy, sad, all the way through the panel. The boards will still slowly release tension, but the panel will remain relatively flat, with all of the boards cancelling the adjacent board's movement out. That's actually something I don't think I did in my butcher block countertop attempt a couple years ago. If you wanted to see how that turned out, you can check that out up here. After numbering the boards to make sure I kept each panel in the right order and marking out the location for the alignment biscuits on the top, I repeated the process for the remaining two tabletops. With all of the boards for the tabletops marked out, I set up the fence on my router table, since it was the first thing I thought of that wasn't on my workbench that I could use to push against, and began cutting out all of the slots for the biscuits, making sure to keep all of the boards oriented the same way so that if the biscuit slots were off-center, the boards themselves would still be aligned. Now that all of the biscuit slots are cut, I can start the glue-up process. I made sure to set up some taped up 2x4s first, the tape to keep the tabletop from gluing itself to the 2x4s, and the 2x4s to keep the panel flat during the glue-up. Filling the slots with biscuits and gluing the seams, I knocked each board together until all of the boards were at least touching. Then I can throw on the 48-inch clamps and start cinching down the panel, though you'll notice that it starts to bow up in the middle the more I tighten down the clamps, which means it's time for the calls. Reset those, clamp them down, retighten the main clamps, and set the top off to the side, and repeat that process for the next two tabletops. The next day I came back and started to unclamp the tops. And when you're unclamping the cauls, you want to make sure that you unclamp it from one end down to the other, and make sure that your head is right next to the loose end. Ow. Idiot. I guess while you're unclamping it, it makes sense to also scrape off any of the glue drips at that point. Why not? The last thing I need to do on the tops is cut a straight edge for the breadboard ends to attach to, which I did with a couple squares, circular saw, and table saw. Since attaching the breadboards is a little bit more of an involved process, I'm going to break that out into its own video, which will be the next one out. If it is already out by the time you are watching this, you can check that out up here. A couple days later, once the breadboards were attached, same thing. Cut the panel and breadboards flush with squares, straight edge, and circular saw. Next up is sanding, starting with 60 grit and finished with 80 grit for now. Since these tabletops are still kind of rough in terms of bug tracks, I figured there wasn't much point in moving past 80 grit at this point. This round of sanding is just to level out the seams to make the next step easier. Once the first round of sanding is done, I move the tabletops into my basement finishing room, where I break out the epoxy again and just did a couple coats of the Ecopoxy UV Epoxy, which is more designed for thin applications. and just scraped a small amount over the top side of the tabletops to fill in any holes that weren't already filled. I only did this on the top side of the table since that's the surface that's going to see the most contact, and this way it avoids getting any food or crumbs inside of the tabletops. While the tabletops were doing their epoxy thing again, I jumped back onto the table base and figured out the interior structure for the leaf extension hardware. I ended up going with a couple 2x4s cut to fit just inside the legs and stretchers. Conveniently enough, they were already the perfect thickness without having to send them through the thickness planer to allow the table extensions I picked up to be just level with the top of the table base. After I cut the boards to length and using the offcut scrap from the table coasters, I mathed out the location of the half laps needed between the 3 boards. Over at the table saw, I broke out the miter gauge and hogged out the half laps. I didn't realize this until the edit. It looks like this board was a little bit bowed and wasn't all the way down onto the table. Makes sense why one of the half laps didn't quite work out. Spoiler alert. To secure the interior frame onto the table base, I went with the only few screws in this whole project and went with pocket holes. The long pieces held themselves into the table pretty easily with tension, however the short piece really didn't want to, so I used some squeeze clamps to hold that in. And with the help of the automotive creeper I've had bolted to the garage ceiling for the last several years, it was quite easy to get in and out from underneath the table to get the interior frame screwed in. With the framing complete, I can get the tabletop extensions installed, center an extension on each long 2x4, clamp it down, pre-drill, and screw it down. And finally, to allow the bolts to screw down the tabletop onto the extensions, I drilled out a few access holes in the extended portion of the extensions. Or at least that was the intention. It didn't quite work out the way I had planned, but that will be covered in a future video. And with that, I'm going to call this video here. I still have quite a bit of work to go on this project, but I'm going to split the rest of the project into their own videos that you can check out in the playlist up here in the following weeks if they aren't up here already. Like I mentioned earlier, the next video will be going over how I did the breadboard ends for the 3 tabletops. It was a bit more of an involved process, so I figured it would make more sense to make it its own thing. And with that, thank you all for watching, and if you like what I'm doing here, give this video a thumbs up and subscribe for more. If you have any questions or comments, I look forward to reading them in the comments section below, and if you want to see more up-to-date projects, you can always follow me on Instagram at JohnTheSchreiner. Otherwise, I will see you here in the next video, and have a good one.